My name is Rachel, and the night I erased every cent of my parents' mortgage should have been the night they finally saw me for who I was. I had wired $120,000 to the bank that morning, closing a debt they had carried for decades. I pictured us sitting around this same dining table, my father's eyes soft with pride, my mother reaching for my hand. Instead, when I told him what I had done, my father leaned back in his chair, stared at me like I was dirt under his shoe, and said, "You are worthless." His voice was flat but heavy, each syllable dropping like a stone into my chest. My fork slipped from my fingers, clattering against the plate. My mother's eyes flicked to his face, not mine. My brother looked down at his plate, but I caught the twitch at the corner of his mouth. Worthless. The word echoed louder than the clink of glasses and the hum of the chandelier above us. I had just lifted a crushing weight from their lives, and in the same breath he crushed whatever illusion of respect I still had left for him. The old floral wallpaper behind him blurred as my vision tightened. My pulse pounded in my ears. My skin burned hot enough to make me dizzy. I thought of the years I had worked 18-hour days, the nights I had eaten cold noodles in a cramped apartment because every cent went into keeping my business alive, the sacrifices I made so that when they needed me, I could step in. They had no idea how many times I had already saved them quietly, and still to him, I was nothing. He took a slow drink of water like we were discussing the weather, then looked away, dismissing me without another word. That was the moment I realized it didn't matter how much I gave, how hard I worked, or how many times I pulled them back from the edge. In his eyes, I would always be the daughter who didn't go to college, the one who didn't follow his blueprint, the one he could cut down to size with a sentence. I pressed my hands into my lap so hard, my nails left marks in my skin. My instinct was to defend myself, to list every achievement, every sacrifice, but I bit my tongue. Not because I was weak, because something in me shifted. This wasn't just an insult, it was a truth I had been avoiding. Nothing I did would ever be enough for him. That night, in that stifling room full of family who stayed silent, I decided I would stop chasing their approval, and I would not just walk away quietly. One day soon, they would see exactly who I had become. They would see it in a way they could never deny in front of people whose opinions mattered to them. The humiliation they had handed me tonight I would return with interest. And when I was done, there would be no mistaking the truth about who was worthless and who wasn't. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. 3 weeks later, the reckoning I had imagined in the heat of that dinner table moment was no longer just an idea simmering in my mind. It was a plan taking shape. I knew I could not simply disappear from their lives and hope they noticed the gap, because people like my father do not reflect unless they are forced to see themselves in a mirror they cannot control. That night, after leaving their house, I had driven aimlessly for hours before ending up parked by the dark river that cut through the center of town, watching the water move under the bridge lights, thinking about every year I had tried to fit the mold they carved for me. My childhood had been a parade of comparisons and corrections. My father, Richard, was the kind of man who believed the only legitimate way forward was a degree from a respected university and a job with a title you could show off at church. My mother, Susan, had been the silent enforcer of those rules, smiling politely while making sure I never strayed too far from what would look respectable. My brother, Mark, was the golden child who played along perfectly, earning the accolades and the attention that never seemed to reach me. From the time I could walk, I wanted to take things apart to see how they worked. I ran lemonade stands with extra flavors and kept track of regular customers. I mowed lawns and made flyers. I babysat and organized the toys by type and size for easier cleanup. At 13, I built simple websites for local shops for a fraction of what the big design companies charged. Every time I came to dinner smelling like grass or sawdust or computer dust, my father would shake his head and tell me to focus on my homework, not these silly little projects. Grades will pay the bills. Not your games, he'd say, and my mother would nod. When Mark won a debate tournament, the whole family went out for steak. When I landed a local store contract for my designs, I got a "That's nice, dear," before the conversation shifted to Mark's college applications. High school was just a countdown for me, not to graduation, but to escape. I did well enough in classes, but I lived for the afternoons when I could work on my ideas. I launched an online shop selling custom phone cases my senior year, making a couple $1,000s before graduation, but to my father, it was a distraction. One day, you'll understand you need a real job, he said at my graduation dinner. I tried college for a semester because that was the deal if they let me live at home. But sitting in lecture halls listening to professors who had never run a business talk about business felt like being locked in a slow, suffocating box. I dropped out at 19 with $2,000 saved from my side jobs, knowing I was on my own. Those early months were brutal and lonely, but they were mine. When I left college, it was not with a grand plan or a safety net, but with a stubborn belief that if I worked harder than anyone else, I could make something real. My first idea was an online boutique selling imported handmade jewelry. I invested almost all of my savings into inventory from a supplier overseas, only to have half the shipment arrive damaged and the other half so different from the samples that customers returned them immediately. I refunded everyone ate the loss and learned the hard way about vetting suppliers and quality control. My second venture was offering social media management for small businesses. I underpriced myself to get clients, juggling 15 accounts at once, answering messages at midnight, and scheduling posts before dawn until I burned out so badly that I quit and dissolved the business. My third attempt was a coffee cart in a busy downtown spot. The first month was promising until winter hit early and foot traffic dropped. I had to choose between paying rent or replenishing inventory. I chose rent. Each failure hurt not just financially, but in the way they confirmed my father's predictions. I could almost hear him saying, "I told you so," even when we weren't speaking. Still, each failure taught me something no classroom could. I learned to read contracts line by line, to negotiate payment terms, to pivot quickly when a product wasn't working. The turning point came when I met Helen at a local artisan fair. She was in her 60s with a sharp wit and decades of experience building and selling businesses. She bought a scarf from one of the vendors, then sat at my booth and asked about my products. I told her my story without dressing it up. Instead of telling me to go back to school, she nodded and said, "You've got the instincts. You just need focus." Helen became the mentor I had never had, introducing me to suppliers in the U.S., teaching me about margins and showing me how to scale without overextending. She believed in the value of American-made products and saw the growing market for them. Together, we sketched out the framework for what would become my breakthrough, an online marketplace connecting small U.S. manufacturers with customers who wanted to support local craftsmanship. I launched it from my tiny apartment, converting half the living space into an office with a desk wedged between the bed and the kitchen counter. I coded the website myself during the day and packed orders at night. I handled customer service calls on a headset while printing shipping labels. The first few months were slow, but then a well-known lifestyle blogger featured one of our makers in a gift guide and orders flooded in. I worked 72 hours straight, sleeping in 1-hour bursts on the couch just to keep up. That weekend brought in over $10,000 in sales, more money than I had ever seen in one place. I called my parents to tell them, my voice shaking with excitement, but my father's response was a flat, "That's nice, honey. Just remember, these online things don't last forever. You can always go back to college." The words stung more than I wanted to admit, but they also lit a fire in me. I would prove him wrong, not with arguments, but with results so undeniable he couldn't dismiss them. Over the next 5 years, the marketplace grew from a handful of artisans in 3 states to over 400 partners nationwide. We hired staff, moved into a real office, and crossed $1 million in annual revenue. There were crises along the way, servers crashing during big promotions, a competitor trying to poach our top sellers' cash flow squeezes that had me skipping my own salary for months. But I adapted, negotiated, and found solutions. Every obstacle made me sharper. By the time I was 31, the company was valued in the millions. I owned my home outright, and I could pay my bills without flinching. Yet every trip back to my parents' house reminded me that none of that mattered to them. To them, I was still the dropout who got lucky. It did not seem to matter how far I had come or how much stability I had built for myself. Every visit to my parents' house carried the same undercurrent of judgment, the same subtle digs wrapped in casual conversation. My father would ask about that website thing like it was a hobby I might get tired of any day. My mother would remind me how much easier life would be with a degree always phrased as concern, but landing like a critique. My brother Mark, the golden child, had a way of steering conversations back to his own promotions, his bonuses, his respectable job in corporate finance. I stayed quiet most of the time, telling myself it was easier than starting an argument that would go nowhere. Still, I kept helping them. When my mother needed surgery and insurance didn't cover the full cost, I wired the hospital $75,000 anonymously, letting them believe it came from an insurance settlement. When Mark's down payment on his house fell short by $40,000, I funneled the money through a family friend so he would take it without pride getting in the way. I even covered the shortfall for my sister-in-law's dream wedding venue when Mark claimed the budget couldn't stretch. Each time I told myself I was doing it for the good of the family, that I didn't need recognition. But the truth was, a small part of me hoped they would see my actions for what they were, proof that I was capable, successful, worth respecting. That hope took its final blow when I learned they were close to losing their house. The mortgage had been hanging over them for years, payments eating into their savings, the threat of foreclosure always lurking. I knew what it would mean for them to own it free and clear, to take that weight off their shoulders. So I called the bank, confirmed the balance, and transferred $120,000 to close it out. I pictured their faces when I told them, imagined a rare moment of pride, maybe even gratitude. That was my mistake. I chose a Sunday dinner to break the news. The table was set the way my mother liked for special occasions, with the good china and the silver she polished every holiday. The roast smelled like every Sunday of my childhood. I waited until plates were full and conversation had drifted to neighborhood gossip. Then I said, "I have some news. I paid off your mortgage. The house is yours free and clear." Silence fell like a dropped curtain. My mother blinked rapidly. My brother froze mid-bite. My father set down his fork, stared at me for a long beat, and said, "You think that makes you special? You are worthless." The word landed harder than any slap. My mouth went dry, my heart pounded in my ears. I had expected questions, maybe tears. Instead, I got contempt so sharp it took the air out of my lungs. He shook his head and reached for his glass like the conversation was over. Mark looked down, his lips twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. My mother glanced at my father, then back to her plate. No one said thank you. No one asked why or how. In that moment, the last thread, tying me to the idea of earning their respect, snapped. Driving away from their house that night, the sky felt lower than I had ever seen it, heavy with clouds that pressed down on the streetlights until they seemed to glow weak and tired. My hands shook on the steering wheel, not from the cold, but from a fury that had nowhere to go. Rain began to fall, smearing the windshield in a blur of orange and white reflections. I pulled over twice on the way home because my vision was too clouded with tears to trust myself behind the wheel. All the years I had poured into proving I was worth something to them unspooled in my mind, and for the first time I let myself see the truth. I had been playing a game I could never win. They didn't want proof of my worth. They wanted submission control, a daughter who measured herself against their standards and always fell short. I got back to my apartment, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the couch without turning on the lights. The quiet was so complete, it was almost loud, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own pulse. I thought about every check I had written, every debt I had cleared, every late-night phone call where I had listened to their problems and quietly found solutions. I reached for my laptop and started writing it all down, not to send to anyone, but to see it with my own eyes. $75,000 for Mom's surgery, $40,000 for Mark's down payment, $22,000 for Dad's truck repairs, $50,000 for the wedding, countless smaller amounts for emergencies and short-term loans that were never repaid. Nearly $300,000 over the years, given without conditions, without public acknowledgement, because I believed family meant helping when you could. Now, it just looked like a ledger of my own humiliation. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I could cut them off, completely disappear from their lives, but that would only confirm the story they told themselves, that I was ungrateful, that my success was a fluke, that I couldn't handle criticism. No. If they were going to dismiss me, they would have to do it in full view of the truth. They would have to see, and so would everyone else whose opinion mattered to them. My father thrived on image, on the respect he commanded at church and in the community. If that image cracked, it would not be because of a rumor or a petty argument. It would be because the facts were laid bare in a setting where he couldn't talk over them, where every word would be heard and remembered. I didn't know the exact shape it would take yet, but I knew this much. The next time I stood in front of them, I would not be the daughter begging for approval. I would be the woman who had built something worth respecting, and I would make sure they and everyone else in the room couldn't pretend otherwise. Over the next week, the anger settled into something sharper, cleaner, like a blade I could hold without it cutting me. I stopped replaying the dinner in my head and started thinking about logistics. The best way to counter years of private dismissal was with public recognition, not in a petty way, but in a setting they could not ignore. I remembered that our town held an annual Community Business Awards ceremony sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce. It was formal enough to attract local press, and winners were often profiled in the newspaper and on social media. My company had been nominated the year before, but I declined the spotlight, preferring to work quietly. This time, I would not decline. I reached out to the chamber, confirmed the event date, and submitted the nomination packet myself. Our numbers and community impact made us a strong contender, and my mentor Helen, who sat on the selection committee, told me confidentially that I was already the frontrunner for Entrepreneur of the Year. The awards night would be perfect. My parents had deep ties to the chamber through church, and my father's decades at his accounting firm. If they were invited to an event in their social circle, they would attend, especially if they thought Mark might be involved. I made sure they would be. Through a mutual contact, I arranged for Mark to present one of the smaller awards that evening, which meant my parents would be there to watch him and, unknowingly, to watch me. In the meantime, I threw myself into work, tightening up the business's year-end results, updating our marketing materials, and making sure the presentation the chamber put together told the full story. I wanted no ambiguity about what we had built: over 400 artisan partners across the country, millions in revenue jobs created in towns that had been losing factories for decades, and yes, the quiet personal contributions I had made to my community and beyond. Helen coached me on my acceptance speech, reminding me to keep it gracious but unflinching. "This isn't about rubbing their faces in it," she said. "It's about telling the truth in a place where it can't be twisted." I nodded, but privately I wanted it to sting just enough to make them remember every time they told me I was nothing. The night of the event, I dressed in a navy gown that fit like it was made for me, hair swept up, a calm smile on my face. The banquet hall glittered under chandeliers, the air full of clinking glasses and polite laughter. I spotted my parents before they saw me, my father in a suit that looked a little tighter than it used to, my mother in a dress she had probably chosen to impress the other wives. Mark stood with them, holding his note cards for the award he would present, clearly enjoying the attention. When the program began, I waited at my table while the earlier awards were handed out, my pulse steady. Then the host announced the Entrepreneur of the Year, and my name filled the room, followed by applause that swelled as I walked to the stage. I glanced toward their table. My father's face froze in the practiced, polite expression he used for strangers. My mother's eyes widened. Mark's mouth opened just slightly. I took the plaque from the host, adjusted the microphone, and began. When I started my business in a one-bedroom apartment, I had no degree, no safety net, and no roadmap. I had what many people considered silly ideas they told me would never last. But over the years, those ideas have connected hundreds of American makers with customers nationwide, kept small businesses alive, and poured millions back into our economy. I let my eyes find theirs again before adding, "Along the way, I have believed in supporting the people who matter to me, often quietly, without asking for credit. But tonight, I accept this award not just for myself, but for the truth that success comes in many forms, and it is not measured solely by credentials." The applause rose again, but in the quiet between claps, I could feel the sting land exactly where it was meant to. The applause faded, and I could feel the room leaning in the quiet. That means people are ready to hear something real. I thanked the host and the chamber. Then I told a short story about one of our makers in Ohio, whose factory lights were about to go dark until our marketplace connected him with buyers who actually cared where their tools came from. I kept it simple and specific, so there was no room to dismiss the work as internet luck. Then I paused and said I wanted to thank a few people who had shaped me even when they did not know it. I looked toward my mentor and the front table where the mayor sat, and I thanked Helen for teaching me how to build without apology. Next, I thanked the community for trusting me with their dollars and their stories. Finally, I said there is one more thing I want to acknowledge because I believe the truth matters. I had submitted a short bio for the program, but I had left out details that were not about revenue or growth. The mayor had not. He stood to my left with a copy of the script the media team had prepared and nodded for me to continue. I turned my head toward him and said I would be honored if you would share the community notes you gathered. He stepped forward and read in his clear, formal voice that the committee wanted to recognize not only the business achievements, but the private acts of service that have strengthened our town in quiet ways. He listed scholarships funded for students who did not have traditional academic advantages. He listed the grants to small workshops on the edge of collapse. He said, and this one is personal because home matters. This entrepreneur paid off the mortgage of 2 longtime residents after a medical crisis drained their savings. A murmur moved across the room like wind through tall grass. I heard one person clap once in surprise and then stop. I watched my father in the third row stiffen as if a wire had been pulled tight inside his suit. My mother pressed her hand to her throat. Mark blinked and looked down at the program as if the words might rearrange into something else. I stepped back to the microphone and let the silence hold a breath longer than was comfortable. Then I said my parents taught me that a house is more than wood and nails. It is the place where you learn who you are. I paid that mortgage because I believed in the value of family even when we did not agree on the path to success. I will not discuss private details beyond that because this is not a night for gossip. It is a night to say that value does not always look like a diploma on a wall. Sometimes it looks like showing up and doing the work and putting your money and your name on the line for people you love. The room applauded again louder now, but it was not the volume that mattered. It was the shape of the sound. It carried respect rather than polite obligation. I thanked everyone and closed with a line I had practiced with Helen in her kitchen. We measure success by what we build and also by what we refuse to destroy in ourselves to build it. Then I stepped away from the podium and stood at the edge of the stage as the host moved to transition the program. Before he could speak, an older journalist from the local paper raised a hand and called out, "If I might answer one question." The host looked at me. I nodded. The journalist asked what I would say to young people who feel dismissed because they chose a different path. I said I would tell them to invest in skills and character and to be ready to show receipts when someone tries to erase their work. Not to buy love with money, but to build a record of actions that tells the truth even when people lie about you. The applause rose a third time, and when it faded, I saw movement at the aisle. My father was standing. For a heartbeat, I thought he might walk out. Instead, he walked forward, slow face, flushed jaw set. He reached the edge of the stage and lifted his chin to look at me. The room went so still I could hear the ice settling in glasses. He said in a voice meant to carry, "I did not ask for your help." The words were familiar, and they should have stung, but they did not. I met his eyes and answered calmly that help was given because it was needed, and because I could give it, and because that is what family should do. I added that tonight was not about debt, but about truth. I said the truth is that I am not worthless, and I never was. The audience did not cheer. They did something more powerful for this room. They nodded, they shifted forward, they listened. The mayor stepped in smoothly and thanked my father for attending and invited him to return to his seat so the program could continue. My father hesitated and then turned back toward his table under 100 eyes that had seen enough to draw their own conclusions. When I left the stage, there was a line of small business owners waiting to shake my hand. Behind them, a woman from my church hugged me so tightly I could feel her breath tremble against my shoulder. She whispered that she was proud of me. I believed her. Across the room, I watched my mother dab at her eyes while Mark spoke to a man from the bank with an expression I could not read. The twist landed not with a shout, but with a quiet shift that you can feel more than you can name. For years, I had been the one diminished behind closed doors. Tonight the doors were open and the story had changed in public view. There was no way to pretend otherwise. In the days after the awards night, the ripple effects spread further than I expected. The local paper ran a feature with a photo of me on stage, the mayor by my side, the caption naming me Entrepreneur of the Year and highlighting the community work the chamber had acknowledged. The part about paying off my parents' mortgage was not omitted. They did not use names, but in a town our size, it was not hard for people to connect the dots. At the grocery store, I overheard two women in the produce aisle saying they could not believe the way my father had looked during the ceremony. At church the following Sunday, according to Helen, who still attended regularly, a deacon approached my father and told him he must be proud. She said my father smiled thinly and changed the subject. For me, the most telling sign came in the form of a text from my mother 3 days later. It read simply, "We should talk." I stared at it for a long time before deciding not to reply immediately. The part of me that once would have jumped to smooth things over was quieter now. A week passed, then my phone rang with her name on the screen. When I answered, she began with small talk about the weather and asked about my business as though the past month had been a pleasant blur. Then she said your father thinks we should have a family dinner to clear the air. I asked if that meant apologizing for what had been said. She hesitated. "He feels things got out of hand," she said. "That is not an apology," I told her, "and I am not interested in pretending nothing happened." There was silence on the line long enough for me to hear her sigh. "You've changed," she said finally. I almost laughed. Of course I had changed. I had stopped bending myself into their mold and started living without their approval as a condition for my peace. I told her I was willing to see them if we could have an honest conversation where respect was not optional. She said she would speak to my father. Another week went by before she called back with a date. I chose a quiet restaurant with private booths not their house because I wanted neutral ground. The night we met, they arrived together, my father in his usual pressed shirt, my mother in a cardigan she wore to every occasion that required effort. We ordered water, the server left us with menus, and I waited. My father cleared his throat and said he supposed he had let his temper get the better of him. I asked if that was his way of saying he was sorry for calling me worthless. He shifted in his seat and muttered, "I should not have said it." My mother nodded as if to seal the statement. It was not a sweeping apology, but it was the most I had ever received from him. I told them calmly that I would not tolerate being demeaned again, and that if they could not respect the work I have done, we would have very little to talk about. My father's mouth tightened, but he agreed. We finished the meal without raised voices. As I left, my mother touched my arm and said she was glad we had talked. I nodded, but as I walked to my car, I knew that while the conversation had set boundaries, the real closure had happened on that stage the night of the awards. That was when I stopped needing them to see my worth and started living by my own measure. After that dinner, I kept contact with my parents on my terms. Weekly phone calls stayed short and surface level, just enough to maintain civility without opening the door for old habits to creep back in. Mark avoided me entirely, which was fine. The tension that had always existed between us had shifted into something colder and more distant. I focused on the parts of my life that felt solid. My company continued to grow, and with the boost of publicity from the award, we signed 3 new national retail partners in the first quarter. I used part of the increased revenue to expand our mentorship program for young entrepreneurs without traditional credentials, pairing them with experienced business owners who understood how to build from nothing. Watching those students develop their ideas reminded me of myself at 19, except now they had guidance I never had. Outside of work, I built a social circle that had nothing to do with my family's approval. Friends who celebrated wins without jealousy and who showed up when I needed someone to listen. We started a monthly dinner rotation at each other's homes, no formal speeches, just food and laughter, and the kind of easy trust I had never felt in my parents' dining room. Helen came often always with a bottle of wine and some sharp piece of advice she would slide into conversation like seasoning. On quiet mornings, I walked through my neighborhood with a coffee nodding to shop owners who knew me by name. There was a peace in these routines that felt earned. Still, the night of the award came back to me sometimes, especially when I passed the community center where it had been held. I thought about the moment the mayor read that line about the mortgage and how the air in the room had shifted. That had been the turning point, the instant when years of dismissal cracked under the weight of public truth. My father would never admit it, but I knew he felt that crack. I also knew it was not my job to patch it. One afternoon, months later, I got an email from the Chamber of Commerce asking if I would present an award at the next ceremony. I accepted not because I wanted to be on stage again, but because I wanted to support the next person whose story might not fit the traditional mold. On the night of the event, I stood at the podium looking out at a room full of faces, some familiar, some new. My parents were not there, and that was fine. I told the audience that success wears many faces, and sometimes the path that looks wrong to others is exactly the one that leads you where you need to be. When I left the stage, a young woman stopped me in the hallway. She said she had dropped out of college last year to start a bakery and that her parents were furious. She had almost given up until she heard my speech. I told her to keep her focus, keep her receipts, and let the results speak when the time came. Walking away, I realized that the most satisfying part of my journey was no longer about proving my father wrong. It was about making sure others like me knew they were never worthless to begin with. The following year became one of the most stable and fulfilling periods of my life. My business thrived under the leadership team I had built, allowing me to work fewer hours without sacrificing growth. I used that extra time to invest in causes that mattered to me, expanding the scholarship fund for non-traditional students and funding a small grant program for rural artisans who needed capital to modernize their equipment. These projects were not about optics. They were about creating opportunities that I knew firsthand could change the trajectory of a life. My home became a gathering place for friends and colleagues. We hosted barbecues in the summer, movie nights in the winter, and impromptu dinners whenever someone had news to share. There was no performance here, no measuring worth by degrees or job titles, only the quiet satisfaction of mutual respect. Every now and then, word of my family would reach me through the small-town grapevine. My parents still attended the same church, still kept up appearances in their social circles. Occasionally, someone would mention the award night, how unexpected it had been, how my father's reaction had left an impression. I didn't seek those stories, but I didn't shy away from hearing them either. They reminded me that the truth has a way of lingering long after the moment has passed. One autumn afternoon, while sorting through old files in my home office, I found the spreadsheet I had made the night after that fateful dinner, the one listing every dollar I had given my family. I stared at it for a while, remembering the sting that had fueled me to create it. Then, without ceremony, I deleted it. I realized I no longer needed a record to justify my choices. The money was gone, and so was the need for their recognition. Not long after I received a formal invitation to the Chamber's annual gala. This time I was not presenting or receiving anything. I was simply a guest. Helen convinced me to go, promising it would be a good chance to connect with other local business owners. The night of the gala, as I stood in the lobby greeting familiar faces, I noticed a quiet stir near the entrance. My parents had arrived. We locked eyes across the room a moment, suspended in the warm hum of conversation and clinking glasses. They approached slowly, my mother offering a polite smile, my father nodding in acknowledgement. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. There was no apology, no attempt to revisit the past, and that was fine. The distance between us was no longer charged with longing or resentment. It was simply the space where I had built my own life. As the evening went on, I found myself laughing at a table full of friends, the memory of that first painful dinner now just one thread in a much larger tapestry. When I left the gala under a clear, cold sky, I felt a deep, unshakable calm. I had learned that family can be chosen, that respect is not something you beg for, and that the truest form of winning is living in a way that no one's opinion can diminish. Whatever my parents thought of me now was irrelevant. The only measure that mattered was the life I had built and the people who were proud to stand in it with me. By the time the second anniversary of that dinner came around, the sharp edges of the memory had worn down into something I could look at without flinching. It was still there, but it no longer dictated how I felt about myself or my work. I had stopped giving my parents the power to define me, and in that space, I had built something richer than I had thought possible. My days began with early walks through quiet streets before the shops opened, coffee in hand, greeting the few neighbors who were also up with the sun. Mornings were for strategy meetings with my team, afternoons for site visits or mentoring sessions with scholarship recipients. Evenings were often spent in the company of friends gathered around my long kitchen table with candles burning low, the conversation flowing easily between serious plans and absurd jokes. Charlie, my rescue dog, had long since claimed the best spot by the fireplace, and Luna, the senior retriever I'd adopted, followed me from room to room with steady loyalty. There was a peace to this life that came from knowing it was mine alone, unshaped by demands I could never meet. That spring, one of my scholarship students, a young man named Tyler, launched his first product line after months of hard work. He invited me to the small unveiling at a local community center. His parents were there, beaming with pride, and as I watched them congratulate him, I felt no bitterness, only gratitude that he had what I never did. He later told me my belief in him had been the push he needed when others doubted him. Moments like that had become my quiet victories more satisfying than any headline. Yet the universe has its way of circling back. In early summer, I received a letter from the chamber inviting me to join their board of directors. Accepting would mean a bigger role in shaping programs for local businesses and more visibility in the community. I said yes without hesitation. My first official duty was to help plan the next awards ceremony. I worked with the committee to ensure one of the new categories honored resilience entrepreneurs who had overcome significant personal obstacles to succeed. When the night came, the recipient's story moved the audience to tears. I watched my younger self in her standing there with her voice trembling but her resolve unshakable, and I felt a kind of closure that had nothing to do with my parents. They were not in the audience. They were not part of this chapter, and that absence was not a loss, it was clarity. As the evening ended, Helen raised a glass to me across the room, her smile carrying more pride than any parent's words could. Walking out into the warm night air, I realized that the truest revenge was not the public reckoning or the headlines, it was this: a life built on my terms, surrounded by people who saw my worth without being forced, and the quiet certainty that I would never again have to prove it to those who chose not to see.